Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people living with MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I serve on the MS Society's Community Review of MS Research Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. Some MS symptoms are not always well managed by FDA-approved medications, and a growing number of people living with MS are exploring medical cannabis as a relief. But there are some important things you should know and consider before using medical cannabis products. Dr. Michelle Cameron is joining us today to discuss the risks and benefits of medical cannabis and how people living with MS are using it. Dr. Cameron is a neurologist and physical therapist and a professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University. Welcome, Dr. Cameron. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here for you and your audience.
Medical cannabis is a popular topic, and before we dive in, we'd like to address any legal concerns people may have. Dr. Cameron?
Sure. So just to be clear, I'm a physician, not a lawyer, and I'm not your doctor. So this information is not medical or legal advice specifically for you. For specific medical advice, consult a qualified physician who's your physician. And for specific legal advice, consult a qualified attorney. But in summary, cannabis, marijuana, is a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substance Act. This is federal law. So under federal law, Schedule I substances are drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. They are not allowed. The use, sale, and possession of cannabis that contains over 0.3% THC, and I'll explain to you what THC is a little later, but over 0.3% of THC by dry weight in the US is illegal under federal law. Now, state laws in many states do permit cannabis use under various circumstances. Those state laws vary from state to state. The National MS Society supports the right of individuals living with MS to collaborate with their healthcare providers in determining if medical cannabis is an appropriate option for them in compliance with state laws. And if anyone is exploring treatment with medical cannabis, consider state law, federal law, implications for your employment. I live in Oregon where state law says cannabis use is legal, but as a physician, and particularly a physician working in a hospital, I may not use cannabis. My employer would fire me if they thought I was doing that. And of course, the clinical knowledge, which is what I'm going to really focus on today. But this sort of sits there in the background to everything we speak about. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. I always like to begin these kinds of conversations by being clear on our definitions. And when this subject comes up, people use a lot of different terms: medical marijuana, cannabis, THC and CBD, to name just a few. So I'm hoping you can get us started by helping us understand what the terms cannabis, cannabinoids, medical marijuana, and medical cannabis each refer to.
Sure, we'll sort of take this from the top and work our way through it. So cannabis or marijuana are basically the same thing. They're the plant that is cannabis. So that's a plant with leaves, flowers, and in that plant are chemicals that act on your nervous system. The chemicals are called cannabinoids. So the plant is cannabis, cannabinoids are the chemicals in the plant. And then when we put the word medical in front of it, medical marijuana or medical cannabis, that's really the same stuff. We're just saying you personally are using it for medical reasons. It's actually not any different than any other kind. It's just what you're using it for.
And I heard you just mention those chemicals. Can you help us understand the difference between THC and CBD?
Sure. So those chemicals, cannabinoids, there are actually over 100 chemicals, cannabinoids in cannabis, but the most prevalent, the ones that are the highest concentration of, are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD, cannabidiol. There's no quiz. I'm not going to ask you to spit those back at me. But THC is psychoactive. That's the thing that makes people high. That's the thing people tend to like because it's fun. CBD is not intoxicating, so not fun necessarily. Sort of barely feel it, might make you a little relaxed, but can still have therapeutic effects. And so those two chemicals are in cannabis, two different cannabinoids, and they can be in the cannabis in different proportions. And you'll see that if you buy cannabis.
How do cannabinoids work in the body, and why are more people with MS using cannabinoid products?
So there's always a little bit of hand waving if we don't know how things work. But with cannabinoids, we know there are two cannabinoid receptors in the body. So your body actually also makes cannabinoids, those same types of chemicals, and those chemicals bind to receptors in you. When you take cannabinoids from the plant, they also bind to those receptors, and then that has downstream effects on your immune system potentially, and on your nervous system, and on other organ systems. And so then you say, well, why are people using cannabinoid products? Well, people are using them sort of as you started with, John. We have a lot of medications for MS, both to try and control the disease and to control the symptoms, and neither are perfect, particularly symptomatic medications. So people are using cannabinoid products to try to further help control their symptoms.
We heard from Brian, and he's wondering if prescription pharmaceutical cannabis products are available and whether any of them are FDA-approved to treat MS or MS symptoms.
Well, let's not make assumptions about where Brian lives. So if Brian lives in New Zealand or in Canada or many parts of Europe, the answer is yes, there's one prescription pharmaceutical cannabis product available to treat spasticity in MS that hasn't responded to other therapies. But if Brian lives in the United States, the answer would be no, there are no pharmaceutical cannabis products available to treat MS or MS symptoms. There are no FDA-approved cannabis products to treat MS or MS symptoms here in the United States. There is one prescription pharmaceutical cannabis product that is approved in the United States. It's a CBD-only product, and it's actually for very rare forms of epilepsy. Quite different. But for MS or MS symptoms, no approved pharmaceutical cannabis products in the US.
What types of medical marijuana products are there, and what are their different methods of administration?
So, oh my goodness, if you've been, as I say, I live in Oregon where recreational and medical cannabis are legal, and the range of products is huge. So flour that people can smoke, there are distillates that people can eat, there's gummies, cookies, and that's just to name a few. So there's all sorts of products, and basically the primary route of administration, people are either smoking it, so inhaling, or they're swallowing it. It's oral in some fashion. or oral mucosal, they're putting it in their mouth. And then there are topical products too. So things you put on your skin, either a lotion, a cream, something you put in your bathtub. So huge range. And then again, as I said, some have more THC, some have more CBD, and that varies too.
Well, we've heard from Charlie, and Charlie wants to know whether there's evidence to support the potential benefit of any medical marijuana products for people with MS.
So almost the entire evidence or research is actually on this one pharmaceutical product that's available outside the US. This is an oral mucosal spray. So you spray it in your mouth, and it's half THC, half CBD. And the evidence supports that it reduces patient-reported spasticity, although not when we measure it as a provider tries to figure out how bad your spasticity is, and seems to also reduce pain, although the evidence for spasticity is the strongest.
Raina tells us she's wondering which marijuana product at which potency will be best for her. Dr. Cameron, clearly this process isn't as simple as just having a prescription filled. With so many options, how does someone even begin?
So I think it takes a mix of things. Raina, as you might guess, I won't give you personal medical advice here on the screen. So it depends. A general principle is start low, see how you feel. We'll get into talking about side effects too. So how's it going to work out for you? But start with low dose, start low, and then build up and see what if and where you hit the sweet spot of having the effect that you're looking for, controlling likely spasticity or pain without side effects or without side effects that make it not worth it. And where do you begin that journey? That usually should be start with your physician, ask them if they think this would be helpful for you. And then you may end up working again with a dispensary because of the huge range of products they have to come up with what works for you, if there is something.
There have been clinical trials to evaluate the impact of cannabinoids on MS-related symptoms. What does research show about the efficacy of cannabinoids for treating MS-related pain?
So yeah, as I mentioned, the evidence is decent, but always a little tricky. That cannabinoids, that one-to-one CBD THC, does seem to be helpful for MS-related pain. Now, it doesn't make it go away completely, but seems to have an impact.
When we think about the common symptoms people with MS deal with, 85% of the people living with MS experience spasticity. Can cannabinoids help people who are experiencing spasticity?
So that's probably the symptom that's the evidence is the strongest for, that this one-to-one THC CBD combo may help reduce your experience of spasticity. Not everybody, but seems to help. Reduces it maybe about 30%.
Violet wants to try medical cannabis for her spasticity, but she says she's embarrassed to bring it up with her doctor. Do you have any advice for how someone like Violet can start that conversation?
I think often that conversation goes something like, "Hi, Violet, how's your spasticity doing? Not so well. Oh, what about these medications? Yeah, they haven't helped me, or they make me too sleepy." And then I think often the easy way is either, well, I heard this talk from the society and I wondered about it. So we've given you a little bit of a starting point right here, or the I know a friend conversation. One of my friends, somebody at a meeting said they tried this. Doc, do you think that would help me? So put it on the outside.
Carol tells us that she experiences bladder dysfunction and that impacts her whole quality of life. She wants to explore medical cannabis to help reduce her urinary frequency. Could medical cannabis help someone like Carol with bladder dysfunction?
It's always a tricky question. Anything could. but the evidence is not strong that this is likely to be helpful for her. I would try other things for sure. And even with pain and spasticity, I'd try other things first. But at least with cannabinoids, for those, there's a decent chance you'll be successful. With bladder dysfunction, much less so.
What do we know about medical cannabinoids managing or improving other MS symptoms like ataxia, tremor, and sleep disturbance?
So interestingly, again, these are symptoms people have looked at. We don't really have good evidence that cannabinoids are helpful for these. And sleep disturbance is sort of growing evidence that although some products may help you go to sleep, if you use cannabis for a while, then if you try to stop it, your sleep actually gets worse. And so it's a pretty slippery slope to try and manage sleep with cannabis.
Jessie says she's wondering whether medical marijuana can help with the emotional and psychological aspects of living with MS, like depression and anxiety.
So that's a really interesting question. Definitely being looked at, even mostly outside of MS, to look at the psychological effects of MS, of cannabis, medical marijuana on depression and anxiety. I think the jury's still out on that. So maybe, maybe not, but we really don't know.
Although many people are finding relief using medical cannabis, it's not without potential side effects. What are the most common side effects someone might experience when using cannabinoid products?
So I think we can look at this from a few different angles. I think there's the THC intoxicating side effects that you probably expect. And we've all sort of run into cannabis out in the regular literature. So it probably won't, while you're using it, make you smarter, right? If you're high, you're probably not thinking quite as well. Doesn't improve your balance, could make you more unsteady. If you have balance problems, that could be a serious issue. You could feel dizzy. You could be hungry, the munchies. You could want to eat more. It can affect people. So really sort of thinking, balance, appetite are probably the most common side effects. And then thinking about it chemically, sort of a side effect is recognize that it can interact with other medications you're taking, making them work either too powerfully or less well. And this is part of why you really need to talk with your doctor. So if I'm going to do this, what's it going to do to the half a dozen other medications I'm taking?
We heard from Joel, who's living with MS, and Joel wants to know if it's safe for him to use medical cannabis, or are the risks higher for people who have MS?
So Joel, again, I'm not your doctor, so I don't know what else you're doing, what else you're taking, what's with you in general. So this is really a conversation between you and your doctor. I think in some ways the risks are higher, though, for people with MS, because as I said, what are our big concerns? Cognitive, balance, and then interactions with other medications. And people with MS often have issues with all three of those. They may have some cognitive dysfunction to begin with, and then we put this on top. They may have some balance problems to begin with, and we put this on top. And then many people with MS are taking many other medications too, so the risk of an interaction is higher. So it's not that MS per se makes cannabis more dangerous, but for people who have it, likely yes.
Angela tells us she's overwhelmed by all the choices she has to make when it comes to medical cannabis. She's wondering if there is a professional that she can consult to figure out what type of medical cannabis product might be best for her.
Yes, Angela, it's very tricky. If you deal with an FDA-approved medication, it's a single drug. It's got a given dose. You know what's in it. And the choices, still, if you worked with your doctor to pick a disease-modifying therapy for MS, your doctor's expertise is in that was a difficult choice. You may have changed it over time, but it's a bit more limited. when you think about cannabis, if you go to the store, it's like going to buy a bottle of wine. Think about how many different bottles of wine there are. That's the same as how many different cannabis products there are. So I don't have a perfect answer for you. I think you want to start again with your healthcare professional, with your physician, to go, is this potentially worth trying for me? What sort of THC CBD combination might work for me? And then think about the route. If you're smoking it, it's hard on your lungs, but it works pretty immediately, so you know what you're dealing with. If you take something by mouth, it can take an hour or even 2 to work. So you could take a little, wait a half hour and go, this isn't doing anything. I'll take a little more. Wait another half hour, still don't feel anything, take a little more. And then 2 hours later go, oh my goodness, I'm floating on the ceiling. That wasn't quite what I was hoping for. I caution you somewhat against using only the people in the dispensaries for advice about products. Although they certainly tend to know that product, they're not medical. So they may try to give you medical advice, but they don't really know about your disease. And so who knows what they'll say, but they are not trained medical professionals. So that's where I would not go.
Destiny says she's been looking at purchasing a cannabis product either online or perhaps going to Mexico. And she's wondering whether there are any safety or quality or potency concerns associated with making a purchase in this manner. She'd like to know if there are safer ways to obtain medical cannabis products.
Sure, Destiny. Again, a little will depend on where you live, what the options are. There are at least laws in many states that try to control the quality, the potency, so that the label accurately tells you what's in something. If it says it's this much THC and this much CBD, somebody's tested it, and that's true. They've also tested it for pesticides, other chemicals, fungus. Those laws vary from state to state. Some states it's completely illegal, so there are no laws beyond that. In each state that has legalized cannabis has slightly different laws about how it's monitored, but at least there's something. If you're buying a product from Mexico or online, that's, I guess I'll call it the Wild West out there. It's beyond the Wild West. There's no regulation. It's actually illegal to sell THC online, but trust me, people do, or they buy something that says it has THC on it online. That's what the label says. Who knows what's in there? Even in the dispensaries, you can't be sure, but you start to go online and buy it on the internet, you have no idea what you're getting. You've got a label, you've got something in a bottle, but what it is, I couldn't tell you. So if you're in a state where medical cannabis is legal, it's most likely that the dispensaries are your safest option. But until we have FDA-approved products that are then monitored, there'll always be that little bit of uncertainty.
Thank you for sharing some important and very useful information with us today. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember?
So I think number 1, if you're using cannabis or cannabinoids for any reason, or you're thinking about it, wondering about it, please discuss this with your physician. I know it's not the most comfortable conversation. It's not the easiest one to start, but it's better to start it and have it than to just be doing that and your provider doesn't know. Nobody can take that into account if we don't know about it. Number 2, cannabinoids may actually help with your MS symptoms, particularly spasticity and pain, but there are also risks of side effects. So this isn't like anything else. It's not risk-free. So recognize it's a balancing act, start slow, and see if the benefits outweigh the risks for you. And number 3, remember there are no FDA FDA-approved cannabis-based medications for MS symptoms in the US, and cannabis does continue to be federally illegal. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing your expertise with us, Dr. Cameron. I think we have time for one more question. Alan wants to try medical cannabis for his chronic pain, but he's concerned he'll get addicted to it. What advice do you have? Can someone get addicted to medical cannabis?
So the quick answer is yes. And the more complicated answer is, so what we used to call addiction, we now call a use disorder. So an alcohol use disorder, a substance use disorder, and there's a cannabis use disorder. This is, in short, continued use of that substance despite adverse effects. You're losing your job, you're spending money you don't want to, it's making you more anxious rather than less anxious, it's making your life worse, but you're still doing it. That's a use disorder. And about 9% of people who use cannabis develop cannabis use disorder, or have cannabis use disorder. So yes, do most people? No. And some people? Absolutely. So not completely benign.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted some excellent questions, and thank you, Dr. Cameron, for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please be sure to visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups. You'll hear about ways to get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that I start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Cameron for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. On YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. And on Twitch, you'll find that link in the chat. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Michelle Cameron and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.